Nurse vanished. From apartment 5B 5 years later, a neighbor's discovery changes everything. Leah Mercer had always lived quietly, her life defined by long shifts, muted evenings, and the fragile rhythm that comes with working in an ER. Apartment 5B sat halfway down the dim hallway of an aging brick building in Portland's Buckman neighborhood, one of those places where time seemed to settle into the walls. Neighbors heard familiar things from her unit every night. The slow footsteps when she got home, the soft thump of her shoes left by the door, the click of her kettle preparing another cup of tea she relied on to unwind. On the night she vanished, nothing about her routine seemed unusual. That was the part that would haunt people later, the normalcy, the repetition of familiar sounds, right up until they stopped. Around 9:40 p.m., the hallway was quiet except for the muffled hum of her television. She'd worked a double shift the night before and was scheduled for another overnight one now, so she moved slowly, conserving energy. Neighbors later said they heard the faint clatter of dishes, maybe the mug she always used, the one with chipped enamel from being dropped too many times after late shifts. Some recalled hearing the low buzz of her phone vibrating on the counter. Others weren't sure if they heard anything at all. It was that fragile kind of night, quiet enough that every sound felt noticeable but forgettable enough that no one realized they were listening to the last signs of Leah being safe. At 10:15 p.m., she was supposed to leave for work. Her shift started at 11, and she always arrived a little early, a habit built from years of never wanting to make more work for anyone else. So, when the ER staff waited for her and she didn't show up, they knew something was wrong. Leah didn't call out, didn't cancel, didn't switch shifts. She was the one others depended on. Her supervisor tried her phone, then tried again. No answer. By midnight, the police were called. When officers arrived at the 3-story brick complex, they expected a misunderstanding or a medical emergency. Missing nurse calls usually meant exhaustion, burnout, or someone locking themselves out. But apartment 5B didn't look like the home of someone fleeing or someone in crisis. The door wasn't forced. There were no signs of struggle. The air inside still carried a faint trace of herbal tea, warm and recent. The mug sat on the coffee table, steam barely visible in the cold apartment. The tea had been made minutes before she vanished. Her keys hung neatly on the hook by the door. Her purse sat on a chair, untouched. Her work bag, the one with her badge, trauma shears, and spare scrubs, rested on the kitchen counter like she'd dropped it there while deciding which jacket to wear. The badge sat right beside it. Her wallet wasn't taken. Her winter coat was still in the closet. None of the signs pointed to a woman who walked out willingly into the cold February night. But her phone, the object she always carried, was missing. Officers noted layers of silence inside the apartment, the kind that belongs to a place left behind too quickly. Everything was pristine, almost staged, but not in a way that suggested someone trying to hide evidence. It was the normal neatness of someone who cleaned because it gave them the illusion of control. Her bed was made tightly, the corners tucked in, a blanket was folded over the couch. Her planner was open on the counter, her handwriting small and even. She had scheduled work, grocery shopping, and a reminder to call her mother, a call she never made. The warm mug suggested she had been present at least until shortly after 10 p.m. That detail stuck with the first responding officer. He would later say he kept thinking about how fast tea cooled, how unusual it felt to walk into a scene still carrying the faint warmth of someone who should have been standing there. Detectives began knocking on doors. Neighbors opened them reluctantly, blinking against the hallway's flickering light. Some were drowsy, some irritated, some confused. The building had a strange way of making people mind their own business, with its creaking pipes and thin walls that had made everyone tolerant of each other's noises but indifferent to each other's lives. One neighbor remembered hearing quick footsteps around 10, maybe Leah's, maybe someone else's. It was hard to tell. Another said she heard a door shut softly, not a slam, but something deliberate. A third mentioned hearing the elevator, which rarely ran after dark unless someone buzzed in a delivery. No one had seen Leah leave. No one heard a cry, a thud, or anything alarming. It was as if silence itself had swallowed her. The building's security system, a decades-old setup with a single camera over the back entrance, offered little help. The footage was grainy, the kind that blurred faces until they looked like smudges moving through fog. It didn't catch the front door at all. It didn't show the stairwell. and everyone knew that if anyone wanted to avoid being seen, there were plenty of blind spots to slip through. The landlord admitted the system hadn't been updated in years. It was more of a formality than a functional deterrent. The detective assigned to the case, a man who had investigated dozens of disappearances, walked through the hallways with a sinking feeling. Cases where everything looked normal on the surface always worried him the most. Crime scenes with broken glass, overturned chairs, or forced entry were easier. Those scenes told stories. But this apartment offered almost no story at all, just a warm mug and an empty stillness that felt more unsettling than chaos. Leah's family arrived in Portland the next morning. Her mother walked into the apartment and froze at the sight of Leah's shoes by the door, perfectly aligned. She touched the mug and silently pulled her hand away when she felt the remaining warmth. Her father stood by the window, staring down at the dim street, his jaw tight. Leah's younger brother paced, pausing only to ask detectives the same questions they were already asking themselves. Why were her personal items left behind? Where was her phone? And how does someone vanish from a building with only one exit and a handful of neighbors awake? Detectives expanded their search. They checked Leah's recent calls, bank activity, work messages, and emails. Nothing unusual. No threats. No secret double life. No suspicious person entering the building on the footage they had. Her phone pinged once around 10:23 p.m., hitting a tower less than half a mile away. After that, it went dark. That single ping widened the mystery. She had either taken the phone with her or someone else had. They brought in residents from the floors above and below. One woman recalled hearing what she thought was Leah's door opening around the time of the disappearance, followed by hurried footsteps heading toward the stairwell instead of the elevator, but she wasn't sure. When pressed, she admitted she was half asleep at the time. Another resident, a man in his 60s, claimed he heard a faint knock or shuffle around 10:30, but he had hearing problems and wasn't confident. Every statement contradicted the last. Every timeline blurred into guesswork. The more the police looked at apartment 5B, the more unnerving it became. There were no signs Leah planned to leave, not even briefly. Her tea was unfinished. Her hairbrush was still on the bathroom counter, with her hair tie wrapped around it, the one she always wore for work. Her work schedule was open beside her badge, as if she had paused mid-routine and simply vanished. Every logical pathway led nowhere. If she left willingly, why didn't she take her essentials? If she left unwillingly, why wasn't there a struggle? If someone came to the door, how did they enter the building without being captured on camera? The more questions investigators asked, the more impossible the case began to feel. By the end of the first week, detectives started focusing on the building itself. It was old with hidden corners, maintenance closets, fire doors that didn't always latch, and a basement laundry room accessible to anyone who knew the code. A building this old could hide secrets, and the people inside it could hide even more. Leah had disappeared, but the place where she lived had not. Apartment 5B, silent and undisturbed, seemed to hold something back. Something that wasn't visible at first glance. Something that made investigators feel like they were missing the one detail that would make the entire room make sense. And when they widened the search deeper into the building's structure, they made their first disturbing discovery, one that would lead them down a path none of them expected, and one that would reveal just how many blind spots apartment 5B truly had. Detectives arrived at the building just after sunrise, stepping into the narrow lobby where the lights flickered in slow, inconsistent pulses. The place smelled faintly of damp concrete and old paint, like a building that had survived far more years than its owner wanted to admit. Leah's disappearance had already begun to ripple through the complex, leaving the residents watchful and uneasy, their voices low and their eyes avoiding one another. Even the elevator doors seemed to groan as if they'd been forced awake too early. They started with the residents closest to Leah's unit, hoping someone had noticed something out of place. Most tenants answered their doors reluctantly, peeking out with suspicion or exhaustion. People in buildings like this were used to minding their own business, but the mention of a missing neighbor softened some expressions. Still, no one seemed eager to talk for long. A woman from the floor below. Leah's rubbed her arms as she spoke, her fingers trembling slightly. She admitted she had heard something the night Leah vanished. Not a scream, not even a full argument, just the sharp, muted tension of raised voices around 9:45 p.m. She couldn't distinguish words, only the rhythm quick, clipped, like two people trying hard not to be overheard. When the sound stopped, she assumed it was just another couple fighting, the kind of noise that drifted through old walls and thin ceilings all the time. She didn't think to report it. Now, her face tightened with regret. Another tenant, a quiet, middle-aged man who lived across the hall, hesitated before sharing what he'd seen. Weeks earlier, he had noticed a man visiting Leah. Tall, maybe, or maybe just wearing a heavy coat that made him look taller. Dark hair, possibly. Or brown. He wasn't sure anymore. Every detail slipped away the more he tried to summon it. When asked if the man seemed familiar, he shook his head. "I never saw him again," he murmured. "Never heard him either." His voice carried frustration, the kind that comes from realizing you should have paid more attention to something you didn't know would matter. As detectives moved through the building, people whispered behind closed doors. Some wondered if Leah had run off. Others were convinced someone had taken her. Nobody agreed on anything except one unsettling truth: the place had always felt off, even before she vanished. Unlit hallways, corners that held shadows too easily, doors that never closed right. It wasn't dangerous, not exactly, but it made the imagination restless. The building owner arrived mid-morning, sweating despite the cold air. His keys jingled loudly as he walked, a habit meant to sound confident, though it only added to the nervous energy around him. He explained the camera situation before the detectives even asked. The hallway cameras on Leah's floor had been down for 3 days, supposedly due to electrical issues. He'd been waiting on a part to arrive. A delay, he claimed, a frustrating one. He insisted it was bad timing, nothing more. Detectives noted how rehearsed it sounded. They asked if any other floors had working cameras. He nodded, but the angles were limited. None pointed toward the stairwells or exterior exits, leaving several blind spots in a building that already had too many places where someone could slip unnoticed in or out. When investigators asked for maintenance records, he promised to retrieve them, though his eyes flickered, unsure, as if realizing how incriminating gaps in those files might look. Officers expanded the search beyond the building, combing nearby streets and alleyways. They checked dumpsters, shook the lids of old recycling bins, pushed open rusted maintenance doors behind neighboring shops. The morning passed in a tense rhythm of searching, calling out, pausing to listen, then searching again. They questioned employees at late-night stores, cafes, and gas stations within a few blocks. No one remembered seeing Leah. No one had noticed anyone dragging, carrying, or leading someone away. Her bank card offered no leads either. No unusual activity. No sudden withdrawals or purchases. Nothing to suggest she had gone anywhere willingly or that someone had used her account after she disappeared. Financial silence could mean many things, but detectives leaned toward the interpretation that felt hardest to accept: that whatever happened to her, it happened quickly. Back inside the building, a forensic report added a new, chilling thread. Leah's untouched tea, still sitting on her kitchen counter, contained traces of anti-anxiety medication. She wasn't prescribed any. She hadn't been known to take anything of the sort, and the amount was enough to make someone calm, or drowsy, or vulnerable. Detectives exchanged glances, but kept their theories to themselves. Someone close to her could have given it to her intentionally or under the guise of helping, or she could have consumed it unknowingly, slipped into her drink before she ever took a sip. Either possibility opened more questions than answers. As the investigation deepened, the detectives studied the building itself, trying to understand its layout, its quirks, its possible hiding places. The entrance facing the street wasn't the only way in. There was a side door that stayed propped open more often than not, a back entrance that led into a narrow alley, half hidden behind dumpsters and recycling bins. 2 stairwells that connected every floor, neither monitored by cameras. And then there were the hallways, long, unevenly lit, lined with doors that didn't always lock properly. While mapping the structure, an older resident mentioned something else: an old maintenance tunnel beneath the building. It had been sealed decades earlier, supposedly after a flooding incident. Some tenants didn't even know it existed. Others had heard rumors about it during renovations in the early 2000s, but no one had ever seen it. Curious, detectives asked the building owner about it. His answer was vague. He had heard of it. Yes, knew roughly where the sealed entrance was, somewhere near the basement, but it hadn't been opened in years. Decades. Maybe longer. It's not relevant, he insisted, his tone tight. But detectives recognized the tone of a man who wasn't entirely certain. With a maintenance worker's help, officers descended into the basement. The stairs creaked, and the air grew heavy, thick with dust and the faint scent of mildew. The light bulbs overhead buzzed loudly, flickering just enough to make shadows sway along the walls. They found the sealed tunnel entrance exactly where the owner said. It would be a large concrete panel bolted into place. But something was wrong. The dust around the edges looked disturbed. The bolts were aged and rusted, but the marks on them weren't. Someone had touched them recently, maybe tried to loosen them, maybe succeeded. Detectives didn't say anything immediately. They simply exchanged looks again, the kind that carried a silent understanding. Either someone had attempted to access the tunnel after all these years, or someone had already been inside. Back upstairs, the tension in the building grew thicker. Every resident seemed to move more quietly. Conversations died when officers passed. People locked their doors, not because they feared the detectives, but because they feared the possibility that someone living among them had something to hide. As night approached, the building's atmosphere shifted again. The old walls creaked more loudly. The poorly lit corridors felt narrower. Every sound echoed longer than it should have. Detectives stood in the hallway near Leah's door, studying the space where the cameras should have been. The missing footage gnawed at them 3 days without recorded activity, 3 days where anything could have happened. They imagined Leah returning home, unlocking her door, setting her bag down, making her tea. Maybe she heard a knock. Maybe she didn't. Maybe her visitor was expected. Or maybe they entered without her noticing, slipping in through one of the building's many unmonitored points. The more they pieced together the fragments of the night, the more the picture blurred rather than sharpened. The argument heard downstairs, the unknown man seen weeks earlier, the camera outage, the drugged tea, the disturbed tunnel beneath the building. None of it formed a straight line, but each detail pressed against something dark and patient, a possibility that someone had been planning something, watching, waiting for the right moment. As detectives closed their notebooks and prepared to continue their search the next morning, one thought lingered in every mind. If someone had taken Leah, they had done it in a place designed with too many secrets, a place where the walls didn't just hide noise, they hid people. And maybe one of those people was watching them, even now, from behind a cracked door or a darkened stairwell, silently hoping the investigation would drift in the wrong direction. The building felt alive in a way that made everyone uneasy, as if it had witnessed everything and chosen to stay silent. And somewhere within its aging walls, buried beneath dust, darkness, and time, was the next clue, the one capable of cracking the case open, or revealing something no one was prepared to face. Weeks turned into months, and the urgency that once pushed investigators through sleepless nights slowly dulled into a quieter, heavier persistence. At first, the department had treated Leah's disappearance as a case that could break open any day, the kind where one overlooked detail, one witness stepping forward, or one lab result returning unexpectedly could change everything. But the days began slipping past without answers, and the small pieces they gathered never aligned into anything solid. Detectives kept returning to apartment 5B, staring at the door as if it should have given them something more, some overlooked sign that might point to where she had gone. Instead, it remained still and silent, its surface carrying the faint fingerprint that no database could match. They followed every lead they could generate. Her ex-boyfriends were questioned, their stories compared against texts, work logs, and travel receipts. Some were defensive, some confused, some regretful. None provided a thread worth pulling. Co-workers described her as kind but private, stressed but functional, withdrawing more in the weeks before she vanished, but never admitting why. A few disgruntled patients had been flagged as potential risks, yet each one had an alibi that held up under scrutiny. The motive, the opportunity, the connection, none of them fit neatly with any of these individuals. The deeper detectives dug, the more they realized they were not chasing a person, they were chasing a void. Outside the scheduled interviews and routine checks, officers organized ground searches through the nearby woods, where joggers often passed and where teenagers sometimes snuck off at night. Volunteers joined 2 neighbors, classmates, strangers who had no reason to care except for a growing discomfort with how abruptly someone could disappear. Search lines formed at dawn, moving slowly through undergrowth, lifting branches, peering under fallen logs, marking areas with tape. Cadaver dogs were brought in from 2 counties, trained to detect the faintest trace of human remains. One morning, one of the dogs paused near a cluster of storm drains at the edge of the woods, letting out a low, uncertain alert. The search team spent hours removing grates, lowering cameras, probing the grime and debris inside. But no sign of Leah ever surfaced, only stagnant water and darkness stretching in both directions. As the case dragged on, suspicion turned toward people who spent the most time inside the building. Residents whispered about the maintenance worker, a man often seen carrying keys, tools, and access to nearly every corner of the structure. Detectives called him in for questioning. His hands trembled slightly, but his answers were steady. He insisted he had nothing to do with Leah disappearing. When the department pulled surveillance from a gas station several blocks away, it showed him filling his truck and buying coffee during the exact time frame investigators needed to place him inside the building. The footage was time-stamped, clear, and aligned perfectly with phone data. The suspicion faded, but the unease remained. Even innocence didn't free anyone from the shadow of what the building had become. Leah's family never let the investigation quiet down. Her mother, exhausted yet relentless, stood outside the building with freshly printed flyers week after week. She handed them to anyone willing to take one, pushing through tears, repeating the same plea until her voice cracked. Some nights, she organized candlelight vigils beside the entrance, gathering friends, neighbors, and sometimes complete strangers who had followed the story online. Their candles flickered against the brick walls, casting trembling shapes that seemed to match the uncertainty of their hope. Her mother spoke about her every time, not as a missing person, but as a daughter who loved reading in bed late at night, who kept her favorite mug on the second shelf, who once drove an hour to comfort a friend going through a breakup. Those moments reminded the crowd that this wasn't a case number, it was a life. Despite her efforts, media attention waned. At first, reporters had camped outside the building, interviewing residents, asking detectives pointed questions, speculating about motives and suspects. But as weeks passed without developments, the story dropped below celebrity scandals, political shifts, and newer tragedies. The silence from news outlets hurt the family almost as much as the unanswered questions. They realized the world moved on quickly, even when they could not. A year later, in a small conference room lit by humming fluorescent lights, the lead detectives reopened the forensic files. They hoped fresh eyes might catch something the initial rush had missed. The partial fingerprint lifted from Leah's doorframe still had no match. It was too incomplete to build a profile from, but too cleanly placed to dismiss as accidental. Someone had touched the frame with intention either entering or leaving, and whoever it was did not appear in any known record. Digital forensics on her phone had also hit an unavoidable dead end. The device had stopped transmitting shortly after she disappeared, with no recoverable location history, no outgoing data, nothing to suggest where it last traveled. It was as if the phone had been swallowed by the same void that took her. Back at the building, new residents moved in, while others quietly left. Over time, rumors began to circulate, spreading through the hallways like drafts slipping under the doors. Some said they heard footsteps at night in the stairwell when no one else was around. Others claimed someone tried their doorknobs in the early hours of the morning, the metal rattling softly, followed by hurried footsteps retreating into the dark. A few whispered about a shadowy figure slipping into the basement when the lights flickered, moving as if familiar with every curve of the old concrete. None of these stories could be verified, and most residents dismissed them as paranoia fueled by a tragic past. But enough people mentioned the same details in different ways that detectives kept listening, unsure whether they were hearing urban legends in the making or fragments of a truth trying to surface. Throughout all of this, Apartment 5B remained exactly as it was the day Leah was reported missing. The landlord refused to lease it again. He claimed it was out of respect, though many suspected it was out of fear. The unit sat behind a locked door, untouched and unentered, except when detectives returned. Dust collected on the windowsill. The faint smell of her tea lingered in the air long after the actual scent should have faded. Something about the apartment unsettled people, as if the space itself remembered what happened, even when everyone else could not. Tenants avoided walking past it alone. Some crossed to the opposite side of the hallway. Others quickened their pace without realizing it. Even visitors sensed something when they approached the door, a stillness that didn't feel entirely natural. Investigators tried reopening lines of communication with residents from that time. Some had moved across town. Others had left the state. A few refused to talk again, insisting they had shared everything they knew. With every interview, detectives heard the same thing in different tones. People wanted closure, but they no longer believed closure was coming. The search of the surrounding area expanded farther, reaching abandoned buildings, old industrial yards, waterways, and trails stretching miles beyond the initial area. Drones scanned dense forest patches that volunteers hadn't been able to reach. Ground-penetrating radar was used in fields that had become overgrown. Every effort ended with the same conclusion: nothing found, nowhere left unsearched, nothing left to explain what happened. As the second year approached, the case showed no new life. The tunnel beneath the building remained sealed, though officers checked it periodically, ensuring the bolts stayed untouched. The basement was quiet again, though no one could say whether the building's silence was normal or a warning. Even the residents who had once whispered about strange noises grew tired, their stories fading into the background noise of daily life. Yet detectives couldn't shake the lingering sense that something had been missed, something small, something easy to overlook, something buried in the timeline or the structure or the human connections surrounding Leah's life. They would revisit her files late at night, flipping through pages, staring at photographs, rewatching grainy footage of the days leading up to her disappearance. Each time, they hoped for a spark, a detail they somehow missed. Each time, they were met with the same bleak emptiness. By the time the third year began, the case had stalled entirely. Meetings about it grew shorter. Updates became rarer. The official stance shifted from active investigation to open but dormant status. No new evidence, no clear suspect, no movement. Just a cold file growing colder. Still, apartment 5B remained locked, the key held tightly by the landlord, who avoided discussing it. Sometimes he paused outside the door during his rounds, staring at it with the strange heaviness of a man who carried something he would never admit aloud. The hallway around it stayed unusually quiet, as if even the air hesitated to move. And somewhere deep within the building, beneath the weight of years and unanswered questions, the unease never truly left. For everyone who had touched the case, detectives, residents, Leah's family, there was a quiet, persistent fear that the truth had always been in front of them. That whatever happened inside those walls had been carefully hidden, waiting for the moment it would finally be forced back into the light. The question was no longer whether the case would break open, but what it would reveal if it ever did, and who would be left standing when it did. 5 years had passed since Leah Mercer vanished, yet apartment 5B remained a silent monument to unanswered questions, untouched and uninhabited, the air heavy with absence. When the building finally underwent a long overdue renovation, the landlord decided it was time to rent the unit again, masking the decades-old unease with fresh paint, new flooring, and the promise of normalcy. Daniel Ruiz, a 33-year-old architecture student seeking a quiet place to focus on his thesis, became the apartment's first occupant in half a decade. On his first night, he noticed the subtle anomalies one often dismisses in older buildings: a low, hollow echo beneath the bedroom floorboards, the faint creak of a joist that did not match the rhythm of the others. Initially, he attributed it to typical settling sounds, to the building stretching after renovations. But instinct whispered that there was something different here, something that didn't belong to the usual acoustics of a renovated apartment. Within days, Daniel began moving furniture, organizing his belongings with methodical precision. That's when he noticed it. One plank near the radiator, slightly misaligned, its edges unnaturally even but unevenly pressed back into place. At first, he considered the logical explanations poorly executed repairs, a subtle shift in the subfloor, or some leftover imperfection from the old construction. Then he dropped his keys while checking a drawer. They slid across the hardwood and disappeared into the narrow gap beneath the plank. The soft thud reverberated in a way that didn't match the expected depth of the flooring. Daniel bent to retrieve them, but the keys seemed to vanish into a hollow that should not have existed. A sinking feeling began to creep up his spine, mingling curiosity with unease, as if the apartment itself were holding its breath, waiting to see how he would respond. The following nights offered no relief. Tapping noises began softly, almost imperceptibly at first, rhythmic and deliberate, originating from somewhere beneath his bedroom. They were not the irregular creaks of old timber or the settling groans of a building. These sounds felt intentional, as if the walls themselves were trying to communicate a secret. Daniel would lie awake, straining to make sense of them, fingers intertwined behind his head, staring at the ceiling. The apartment seemed to throb with life beneath him, a subtle pulse that could not be explained by plumbing, traffic, or wind through the cracked window panes. Sleep became fitful, punctuated by the occasional knock or thump, small enough to dismiss during the day, but insistent enough at night to leave him restless and questioning his own perception. Was it merely the building adjusting to new tenants, or was it something more deliberate, a lingering remnant of the past? Haunted by the noises, Daniel sought context. He began asking other long-term residents about the apartment, carefully phrasing questions to avoid revealing too much, to avoid seeming paranoid. Many deflected, offering vague statements about renovations, new management, or building age. One elderly resident, a woman who had lived in the complex for decades, paused noticeably when he mentioned apartment 5B. Her hands tightened around the railing of the lobby stairs, her eyes clouding over with a memory she had long tried to suppress. Finally, with a voice low and hesitant, she said, "Someone went missing here. They never found her." The words struck Daniel with a quiet force, punctuating the silence that had surrounded the apartment for years. A chill ran through him, settling deep in his chest. What he had assumed were ordinary noises were now framed in a context he could not ignore. From that moment, Daniel's days and nights became consumed by apartment 5B's past. He studied floor plans and building schematics, cross-referencing them with photographs of the original layout. He mapped out every possible point of access: the narrow maintenance tunnel long thought sealed, the hidden utility panels, the crawl spaces and old wiring channels. Every creak, every uneven plank, every hollow thud gained significance. He experimented cautiously, pressing his weight on the suspect floorboard, listening to how it flexed under pressure. He tapped along the edges, sometimes hearing faint responses, almost imperceptible echoes that seemed to suggest cavities larger than the surface indicated. It was obsessive work, driven not only by curiosity but by a creeping dread that the apartment had deliberately concealed something that had remained out of sight for 5 long years. His fixation extended to the smallest details. The radiator near the misaligned plank became a focus. Daniel noticed a subtle distortion in the baseboard where it met the floor, a slight indentation that suggested repeated pressure or an object being moved beneath it. He removed a portion of the baseboard, prying gently, and found an empty void that ran under the apartment. It was narrow but deep, hidden from casual inspection, just wide enough for something to be stored or perhaps for someone to pass through. The hollow felt unnatural, almost too deliberate in its construction. It was as though the building itself had been designed to conceal, to obscure, to swallow any evidence of what had occurred years earlier. Daniel began recording everything meticulously, sketching diagrams, marking potential weak points, tracing sounds, photographing inconsistencies, and compiling them into a growing body of observations. Other residents noticed his obsession, whispering among themselves about the new tenant who spent long hours crouched in corners, lifting floorboards, and muttering to himself while inspecting cracks in the walls. Some feared he had gone too far, tampering with areas best left undisturbed. Yet Daniel pressed on, driven by a conviction he could not fully articulate that the apartment itself held the key to what had happened to Leah Mercer. Each evening, the tapping beneath him became more frequent, almost impatient, as if urging him to continue. He set up a nightly routine, sitting with a flashlight, gently probing the floor with a thin metal rod, noting the echo, the resistance, the hollow spaces. Slowly, patterns began to emerge, subtle variations that indicated chambers or voids beneath the old timber, the remnants of a concealed structural feature perhaps used decades ago for maintenance, now long forgotten. One night, as rain lashed against the windows, Daniel's patience was rewarded. He lifted the misaligned plank fully, revealing a narrow cavity that extended beneath the bedroom floor. It was dark, dusty, and cramped, just wide enough for an arm to fit inside. The air smelled faintly of damp earth, and the shadows within seemed unnaturally still. He hesitated, recognizing that this discovery, minor in some respects, marked the first tangible evidence in a case that had grown cold over half a decade. He retrieved a small flashlight and guided it carefully into the space, revealing fragments of objects embedded in dust, a button, a metal clasp, and a shard of ceramic items that could have belonged to anyone, yet carried the weight of 5 years' silence. His pulse quickened as he realized he was no longer simply a tenant. He was now a participant in uncovering a secret that had remained hidden far too long. The following days were consumed by Daniel's investigation. He returned to the apartment with tools, measuring instruments, and cameras, documenting every detail. He attempted to contact local authorities, presenting photographs and sketches, explaining what he had discovered and the noises that continued to echo beneath the floorboard. The police listened, cautious but intrigued, recalling the old case file of Leah Mercer. They agreed to perform a preliminary inspection, checking for structural hazards and potential evidence. Daniel accompanied them, guiding their attention to the misaligned plank, the hollow cavity, and the subtle signs of tampering. Their interest rekindled. The detectives, who had long grown frustrated with the cold trail, now had a tangible lead, the first real development in years. Residents grew uneasy as activity in the building increased. Workers entered apartment 5B for minor renovations requested by the police, while forensic teams probed the basement and hidden passages. Daniel, though exhausted from sleepless nights, continued his own meticulous documentation, convinced that each detail mattered. He noted the depth of the cavity, the locations of minor indentations in the floor, the way the tapping noises shifted when he pressed against different areas. Each observation contributed to a larger map, a mental reconstruction of what had likely occurred on the night Leah disappeared. The apartment that had once been merely a residence had become a crime scene in miniature, a complex puzzle demanding patient, deliberate attention. Despite the progress, fear and uncertainty never left Daniel. At night, the tapping continued, louder, more deliberate, almost impatient in its rhythm. He often lay awake, listening to the vibrations echoing beneath his mattress, wondering what had been buried, what had been concealed, and why no one had discovered it sooner. He feared what he might find, yet was unable to ignore it. The mystery demanded resolution, and the weight of inaction for 5 years had created a pressure he could no longer resist. By the end of the first month, Daniel had developed a routine that bordered on ritual. Each evening, he meticulously adjusted the floorboards, tapped along the edges, and documented any variations in sound. He cross-referenced his findings with old blueprints, identifying potential structural anomalies that had been neglected or hidden during previous renovations. He created diagrams indicating where cavities might exist, the possible paths for movement beneath the floor, and the points where evidence could have been concealed. His meticulous work, combined with forensic support, began to piece together a partial reconstruction of the apartment's hidden substructure, a framework that may have held the key to Leah Mercer's disappearance. Every detail fed into Daniel's growing fixation. He became consumed with understanding how an apartment could hold a secret for years, how its silence could conceal so much. The misaligned plank was no longer merely an oddity. It was a portal into a history that had been ignored, forgotten, and feared. The tapping noises were no longer random. They were evidence of a hidden rhythm, a signpost pointing toward the truth. And with every night spent listening, documenting, and probing, Daniel felt a connection to Leah, not a personal connection, but a link forged through space, silence, and shared confinement. The apartment, once merely a home, had become a vessel for memory, for loss, and for the beginning of long-awaited answers. By the time investigators returned for a full forensic sweep, guided by Daniel's notes, the apartment was alive with possibility. For the first time in 5 years, the silence of apartment 5B was met with deliberate attention. Every creak, every hollow thud, every displaced floorboard became a clue rather than a haunting echo. And for Daniel, the quiet, persistent tapping beneath his feet was no longer just an irritant, it was a summons, beckoning him closer to the secret that had waited silently for years, ready to reveal the truth. The tapping beneath Daniel's feet had grown impossible to ignore. Nights were restless, filled with that subtle insistence, the hollow vibrations that seemed to pulse beneath the floorboards. Each echo demanded attention, a quiet insistence that there was more to apartment 5B than met the eye. After weeks of hesitation, Daniel finally lifted the misaligned plank entirely, exposing a narrow cavity just wide enough to fit an arm. Dust coated the inside like decades of forgotten memories, the stale air heavy with neglect. At first, the emptiness seemed complete, just a forgotten subfloor. But then Daniel's flashlight revealed a small corner that looked unnaturally disturbed. Something had been moved. Something had been placed here and left to rot in the shadows, hidden from the casual eye, shielded by time and silence. Heart hammering, he crawled carefully into the cramped space. The cavity narrowed and twisted, forcing him to crawl on his stomach, scraping against splintered wood and jagged edges of old beams. His flashlight beam caught something wedged tightly between structural supports. A canvas messenger bag, worn in water, stained. The colors faded to a dull gray, but unmistakably modern enough to have been placed there recently at the time of Leah Mercer's disappearance. His breath caught as he gently tugged it free. The bag was heavier than expected, stiff with age and the remnants of whatever it had contained. He opened it slowly, the smell of decay wafting into the room, and froze. Inside were fragments of a life abruptly abandoned. Decayed clothing, a broken phone with a shattered screen, and the object that made his stomach knot, Leah's hospital ID badge, worn and bent, yet unmistakable. Daniel's hands trembled as he traced the badge with a finger, confirming that this was no random discovery, no forgotten personal item of a past tenant. The phone's SIM card remained intact, a potential treasure trove of information, though the screen was fragmented and unresponsive. The evidence was both thrilling and horrifying, the realization settling into him with cold precision. Leah Mercer had never left apartment 5B willingly. She had been hidden, or trapped, beneath the very floor she once walked on. Daniel felt a wave of disbelief and revulsion, followed immediately by an urgency that left him shaking. He called the police without hesitation, relaying every detail to the dispatcher. Detectives who had long considered Leah's case cold responded quickly, intrigued and alarmed by the potential breakthrough. Within hours, a forensic team arrived with equipment to safely inspect the cavity and retrieve the evidence. Gloves, flashlights, and cameras moved methodically through the space, every inch documented with precision. The messenger bag was carefully removed, its contents cataloged and sealed for examination. Every piece of debris, every fragment, was photographed and bagged, preserving the story that had been trapped in dust and shadow for 5 long years. Forensic analysis brought immediate clarity. The decayed clothing contained trace fibers, matching samples taken from Leah's apartment, while fingerprints lifted from the bag and the surrounding cavity matched the partial print previously discovered on her doorframe, a detail that tied this hidden space directly to the night she vanished. DNA analysis confirmed the human connection, leaving no doubt. This was the place where Leah had been concealed, a location deliberately overlooked in the original investigation. Daniel watched as experts traced the measurements of the shaft, mapping it carefully. They noted how the cavity could only be accessed from within the building, through spaces known only to someone familiar with the apartment's interior. It was not a random act of violence or chance. It was planned, methodical, and chillingly precise. The police began tracing potential suspects who could have possessed intimate knowledge of the building's hidden spaces. Maintenance records were reviewed in detail, former employees interviewed, and any visitors to 5B around the time of Leah's disappearance scrutinized. The narrow shaft, once sealed and forgotten, now became the central piece of the puzzle, revealing both the physical and psychological architecture of the crime. It became evident that whoever had placed Leah's belongings there had carefully planned the concealment, ensuring that even a thorough search of the apartment would not reveal her presence. The precision suggested familiarity with the building's hidden designs, the kind of knowledge that only someone connected to the property could possess. As investigators pored over the evidence, the broader implications became clear. The case that had haunted Portland for half a decade suddenly erupted with new urgency. Police canvassed tenants who had lived in the building at the time, examining every possible lead. Surveillance footage from nearby streets and businesses was reanalyzed with heightened scrutiny. The shaft beneath 5B, previously invisible and inert, now dictated the trajectory of the investigation. Every detail of the apartment, every creak, every hollowed space, became a potential clue. Daniel, though exhausted from sleepless nights, continued assisting, guiding detectives to anomalies in floorboards, the subtle shifts in construction, and any remaining signs of disturbance that might yield further insight. The psychological weight of the discovery was palpable. For Daniel, the apartment was no longer merely a home, it was a vessel of trauma, a place where 5 years of silence had accumulated into dust, decay, and hidden horrors. His nights were still punctuated by small, inexplicable noises, though now they seemed less mysterious and more like echoes of past events, reverberating through the hidden cavity. Neighbors whispered of the renewed activity in apartment 5B, the arrival of detectives and forensic teams, and the slow illumination of truths that had long been buried. The building that had once held secrets quietly now stood as a stage for confrontation, both with the physical remnants of Leah Mercer's disappearance and the human culpability that had allowed it to remain hidden. Meanwhile, the forensic teams continued their meticulous work. Every fragment from the canvas bag and the surrounding cavity was analyzed. The broken phone, though largely destroyed, was subjected to advanced recovery techniques to extract SIM data, call logs, and text messages. The ID badge and personal items were cataloged as evidence, to be compared against witness accounts, entry logs, and potential suspect timelines. This convergence of physical evidence and digital reconstruction created a tangible narrative for a case that had seemed intangible for so long. Leah's story, once suspended in speculation, was now anchored in proof, the tangible artifacts speaking louder than rumor or conjecture ever could. The discovery beneath the floorboards transformed not only the investigation, but the emotional landscape surrounding the case. Leah's family, who had spent years in despair, organizing vigils and distributing flyers, finally received the confirmation that their daughter's absence had not been random. The location of her hidden belongings offered both horror and solace. Horror in understanding the meticulous planning behind her disappearance, and solace in knowing that she had not been abandoned or lost to the world, but concealed in a defined and discoverable place. The human psyche began to process the revelation, a mixture of grief, outrage, and the faintest spark of closure flickering through years of uncertainty. Daniel, now deeply intertwined with the investigation, became a quiet witness to both the forensic process and the emotional upheaval it triggered. He documented everything, maintaining the integrity of the apartment as evidence. He spoke carefully with detectives, sharing observations about the construction anomalies and floorboard inconsistencies. His architectural insight proved invaluable, revealing how the hidden shaft could have been accessed and manipulated without notice, and how minor structural shifts over the years may have inadvertently preserved the concealed space. His contribution reinforced the idea that the apartment itself, long, silent, and overlooked, held the key to finally unlocking the case. By the end of the first week after discovery, the building was filled with a controlled sense of urgency. Forensics mapped every possible point of entry, dusted every surface for latent prints, and scanned every accessible cavity for additional items. What had been an abandoned, uninhabited space for 5 years had become an epicenter of revelation. Investigators, armed with Daniel's notes and the physical evidence from the shaft, began constructing a plausible sequence of events for Leah Mercer's disappearance. The narrative that had been elusive for years began to solidify. Someone with knowledge of the building's hidden architecture had taken advantage of its obscurity. leaving behind subtle traces now finally illuminated by persistence, observation, and an unsuspecting new tenant. The tapping noises that first drew Daniel's attention, once maddening in their subtle insistence, now carried a weight of meaning. They were reminders of a hidden presence, markers of what had been concealed beneath layers of floorboards and years of neglect. For Daniel, each night spent listening, documenting, and observing became a ritual of connection, bridging the gap between a missing person and the chance to restore truth. Apartment 5B, once a silent witness to disappearance, had become a conduit for revelation, forcing both its new inhabitant and the authorities to confront the calculated cruelty that had allowed Leah Mercer to vanish for 5 years. The case, dormant and unresolved, had been resurrected with the simple act of lifting a floorboard and peering into what had been hidden all along. With the discovery secured and the shaft catalogued, the investigators prepared to trace leads directly connected to the crime. The evidence revealed a shocking clarity. The disappearance was neither random nor accidental. Apartment 5B had concealed not just a person, but a plan, a structure designed to hide, manipulate, and mislead. And while the physical artifacts provided the first tangible answers, the emotional implications rippled outward, affecting residents, family, and Daniel himself. The apartment had spoken, and those willing to listen had finally begun to understand the depth of the secret it had kept. The cold case, dormant for half a decade, had been reborn, and the truth beneath the floorboards was only the beginning. The moment the forensic teams returned to Apartment 5B, the sense of inevitability settled over everyone involved. After 5 years of uncertainty, speculation, and dead ends, Daniel Ruiz's discovery beneath the floorboards had reopened the case, providing the first tangible lead that could finally piece together Leah Mercer's disappearance. Experts methodically mapped the shaft, scanning every inch with high-resolution imaging, photographing every artifact, and collecting trace biological material for analysis. It was meticulous work, painstakingly reconstructing a timeline that had remained a void for half a decade. What emerged from this reconstruction was chilling in its simplicity and devastating in its clarity. Leah had likely confronted someone she knew, someone who had intimate access to her life and her building, and had been incapacitated within the confines of her own apartment. Investigators traced the fingerprints lifted from the cavity and the objects within it, cross-referencing databases and past employment records. The prints matched a man who had been a maintenance contractor in the building briefly, around the time of Leah's disappearance. His name had been quietly forgotten by most tenants, a shadow in the building's operational history, but his digital footprint was sparse. He vanished completely from social media and employment records after Leah disappeared, as if he had been erased from every directory. 2 years later, he died in a car crash out of state, leaving no further trace of his movements, no electronic communication, and no explanation. For the detectives, this combination of disappearance, employment access, and timing painted a portrait of premeditation that was impossible to ignore. The evidence suggested he had been observing residents quietly, establishing familiarity and opportunity, and Leah had unwittingly stumbled into a situation that he had meticulously prepared for. Inside the shaft, forensic teams discovered additional materials that underscored the grim reality of Leah's final moments. A small, collapsible ladder, positioned just inside the hidden cavity, indicated how someone could have navigated the narrow space without leaving visible signs on the main floor. Rope fibers, frayed but structurally intact, were tangled among the floor beams, consistent with improvised restraints or securing of objects during concealment. Notes, scrawled on yellowed legal pads, revealed that the contractor had been tracking multiple tenants, recording patterns of movement and times when the building was least observed. It was a horrifying revelation, evidence of a predator operating silently within the community, exploiting blind spots in both architecture and oversight. Leah, in this context, had become an unintentional witness to his methodical surveillance, a threat he could not ignore. The realization sent a shiver through investigators and the new tenant alike. This was not a random act of violence, but a calculated, targeted disappearance, executed with cold precision. The forensic reconstruction suggested that the drugged tea found on Leah's kitchen counter had played a central role. Traces of anti-anxiety medication, the same that had been found in her initial blood work, were administered surreptitiously, rendering her unconscious and unable to resist when the contractor moved her into the hidden maintenance shaft. The floorboard that Daniel had initially noticed, slightly misaligned and hollowed, served as the perfect access point. Its subtle displacement had been intentional, designed to conceal the entrance to the shaft and prevent accidental discovery. The combination of timing, chemical incapacitation, and architectural manipulation revealed a harrowing level of planning. Leah's disappearance had not been spontaneous. It had been orchestrated in advance, with every step designed to remove her entirely from sight and delay discovery for as long as possible. Biological evidence collected from the shaft confirmed the worst suspicions. Tissue remnants, hair, and other trace material indicated that Leah had suffered blunt force trauma shortly after being placed in the cavity. Medical examiners concluded that her death was immediate, the result of violence rather than neglect or prolonged confinement. This grim confirmation ended the speculation that had haunted her family for years, that perhaps she had wandered, escaped, or was being held somewhere unknown. The truth was stark and unflinching. Leah Mercer never left apartment 5B. She had been beneath it the entire time, her absence hidden within the very foundation of the building she called home. The revelation was suffocating in its finality, bringing closure to a case that had become a silent obsession for family, neighbors, and law enforcement alike. Further examination of the shaft revealed additional layers of the contractor's covert operations. Hidden compartments, small enough to conceal tools or personal items, suggested he had used the space for more than a single incident. Investigators theorized that the contractor had been testing the limits of the building's hidden architecture, refining a method that could be repeated without notice. Notes recovered in the cavity detailed observations about movement patterns, entry points, and times of day when residents were most vulnerable. The level of documentation implied a predator with a psychological fixation on control and concealment, someone who had engineered opportunities for manipulation and disappearance. The careful preservation of Leah's belongings within the cavity, now discovered 5 years later, underscored the deliberate nature of the concealment and the cold efficiency with which he had executed his plan. For Leah's family, the discovery was a collision of grief and relief. Years of unanswered questions, of vigils in the street, and prayers whispered into the night, culminated in a single moment of horrifying clarity. Police brought the evidence directly to them: the badge, the decayed personal effects, the confirmed forensic details, a tangible acknowledgement of what had happened, a truth that had been suspended in uncertainty for half a decade. Her mother, who had clutched photographs and handed out flyers for years, could finally place the fragments of Leah's life into context. The rage, sorrow, and heartbreak were palpable, yet there was also the faintest flicker of resolution, the recognition that the mystery, at last, had a definitive answer. The story of Leah's disappearance, once abstract and maddeningly incomplete, now had a concrete trajectory marked by human intention and architectural concealment. Daniel, meanwhile, became an integral witness to the narrative of closure. His initial curiosity, the tapping under his feet, and the misaligned floorboard had sparked the investigation that unearthed the truth. Police and forensic experts relied on his observations and careful documentation to understand the spatial dynamics of the shaft and the practical logistics of the contractor's concealment. The apartment, once an innocuous space for an unsuspecting tenant, had become a site of revelation, bridging years of mystery with the cold clarity of physical evidence. Daniel's role reinforced the idea that even a single, attentive observer could break through the layers of planning and secrecy, revealing the hidden mechanisms behind a disappearance that had confounded authorities for years. Investigators reconstructed the timeline with painstaking attention. Leah, after her shift and routine activities, had been approached or confronted by the contractor, someone familiar to her, or at least not immediately suspicious. Once incapacitated via the drugged tea, she was moved into the maintenance shaft through the deliberately loosened floorboard. The sequence of events was horrifyingly efficient, leaving no witnesses, no immediate traces, and no opportunity for intervention. Subsequent days of searching, spanning nearby streets, stairwells, and even the sealed maintenance tunnel, had failed because the key to her concealment was intimate knowledge of the building itself. The contractor's death years later left the case stagnant, with the perpetrator removed from the equation. Yet the evidence beneath the floorboards ensured the story could finally be told. The psychological implications were profound. The apartment, a space meant to house ordinary lives, had become a trap, manipulated by a predator exploiting both architecture and trust. Residents who had once felt safe within their own homes began to reassess their memories, recalling minor disturbances, odd noises, or unexplained observations that had previously seemed trivial. The building's structure, long overlooked, emerged as both literal and symbolic evidence of vulnerability, a testament to the ways human knowledge and premeditation can turn mundane spaces into instruments of control. For law enforcement, the case provided lessons in vigilance, documentation, and the importance of spatial forensics in cold cases, insights born from tragedy, but applied in the service of truth. By the end of the investigation, the narrative of Leah Mercer's disappearance was complete, though the emotional toll was immense. The floorboards of apartment 5B, the cavity beneath them, and the recovered items had exposed the full scope of the crime. The predator's identity was posthumously confirmed, the sequence of events reconstructed, and the evidence conclusively linked to the location. Leah had never left. She had been hidden in plain sight, beneath the very apartment she had called home. A truth that had eluded everyone until Daniel Ruiz, a quiet architecture student, had unwittingly triggered its revelation. The case closed not with fanfare but with the somber acknowledgement of what had been lost, what had been concealed, and what had finally been discovered. Leah's family gathered outside apartment 5B once the forensic teams completed their work, holding a quiet vigil. Candles flickered in the evening wind, casting soft shadows against the brick facade. There was grief, still raw and undeniable, but also a sense of completion, a truth finally unearthed, a story closed after half a decade of haunting uncertainty. Neighbors, tenants, and investigators alike understood the gravity of what had been uncovered. A life taken, a predator exposed, and a mystery finally solved. The apartment, once ordinary, had become a symbol of hidden danger, human obsession, and the relentless pursuit of truth. And for Daniel, standing quietly by the entrance, the tapping beneath the floorboards had finally ended, leaving behind only the echoes of revelation and the weight of a story that would never be forgotten.